Garrett and Zoe, as infants, can't really have known or remembered much, right? Of course. So tell me about, I guess, the timeline, Kimmy, as hard as this may be to recount. Just give me the breakdown of what that was like, the lead up to September 11th.
You mean on that actual day?
Exactly.
On that day, it was just a normal morning. You know, it was a Tuesday morning. The sky was real blue, gorgeous day. I was outside in my car and I was measuring distances because on September 15th, Frank and I were supposed to compete in a duathlon in Saint Sever, north of Montreal. So I was out measuring, it was supposed to be 3 kilometer run, 30K bike, and another 3K run. So I was out in my car. Um, our housekeeper was at home actually with Zoe and Garrett at the time. And I heard on the radio that a commercial aircraft had hit the World Trade Center. And I didn't have a phone with me. I heard it on 1010 News. So I raced home to our house. And I remember having a hard time putting the key in the door to the house because my hand was just shaking like crazy. And I was so desperate to get to a phone to try to call Frank. So I first heard on the news that a plane had hit the World Trade Center, but I didn't know which tower. I didn't know if it was a big plane, a little plane. I remember looking up at the sky and thinking it's a perfectly blue sky, clear day. Like, how come a plane hit the World Trade Center? So I got into the house and I picked up a landline and I called Frank's office right away. And someone answered the phone and they said, Frankie, what one? It's Kimmy. So Frank picked up the phone and I was just so relieved that he was able to pick up the phone. I could hear his voice. And he said to me right away, he says, if you think we got rocked in 93, he said, this was 10 times worse. Because in 1993, we both lived through the World Trade Center bombing. And he said that they were knocked right out of their seats onto the floor when the plane hit the other building.
What was your correspondence from then at that point? Okay, you have that relief that he was okay in that moment, but then what changed? What happened?
Well, my immediate reaction was, Frank, get out of there. I said, best case scenario, your windows are going to shatter. I'm like, go down, go get a coffee. There was plenty of time before the stock market would open. The opening bells at 9:30. And this, I believe, was just after, I can't remember what time this was actually. And so he said to me, can you call my mom and call your mom and tell them that I'm okay, that it's not my building and that I'm okay. So I hung up the phone. I called his mother in Michigan. I got her voicemail and I left a message and I said, I just got a call from Frank. Don't know if you're watching the news, but the World Trade Center has been hit. It's not Frank's building and he's okay. And then I hung up and I called my mom. And as I was speaking with my mother, telling her that he was okay, I had call waiting from my close friend who lived in Englewood. And she said, Kimmy, I don't know if you're watching the news. And she said, Frankie's building was just hit. And she said, I'm going to come over right away. So she came over to the house and I was in the living room holding Zoe, and our friend Sandy was holding Garrett. And we're watching the TV and his building was on fire. The first building was on fire. And we were actually watching the screen live when the building collapsed at 9:59, when his building was the second to get hit, but the first to go down.
You're cool.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right. I was actually going to ask you that because it's what I read, and that's okay. The timeline.
I was trying to call him after his building was hit, and I kept getting a busy signal. And I tried calling his cell phone, and no one answered. And at 9:22, the phone rang, and I picked up, and it was Frank, and he was very calm. And he said, I need you to listen to me carefully. He says, I've been up to the rooftop and the rooftop doors are locked. He says, we're trapped on the 87th floor and it's getting difficult to breathe. And I could hear lots of voices. I could hear, shuffling and coughing. I could hear the glass breaking. I assumed that it was for a fire extinguisher. And he said, I know you know this, but I love you, sweetie. And I need you to promise me to tell Zoe and Garrett every day for the rest of their life how much their papa loves them. He says, but right now I need your help and you need to call 911 and you need to tell them that we're trapped on the 87th floor. And he said, I love you. And then he hung up. And I didn't realize that that would be our last call.
What was that like for you, beyond that, between the time of, watching on the TV what actually happened? What was all of that like for you, that whirlwind of a time?
I mean, I made the call to say where they were at 9:24 and was very careful to give the exact information he'd just given me. It didn't seem like he had much time, from the time that we hung up to the time that the building collapsed. But I was doing different scenarios in my mind, like maybe he's, was able to get out. Maybe he went down. Maybe he went up to the rooftop. Like it was just, it wasn't possible to really process what was happening. It just happened all so quickly.
From that point, once you learned what had happened to Frank, what was your immediate reaction, going through the motions of this tragedy?
I think the initial thing that happened is different wives whose husband worked with Frank. We started to call each other and try to piece together, who had spoken to who. Like I think right after my call with Frank at 9:22, I called um, a few of the wives' families that we were close to, and people were reaching out to each other and just trying to figure out who was where. Were they all together on the 87th floor? And after the building collapsed, I don't really remember, but I know my parents and very close family members arrived very quickly. So I'm assuming when they saw the news of what was happening in New York, people started to arrive at our house. It's a bit of a blur in terms of how long it took. I have a very close friend who left home right away from Boston. So he got to the house a bit sooner than my family arrived, but our house filled up really quickly. I think by, Tuesday night, we probably had at least 20 people sleeping in the house. And it was just a bit chaotic because we didn't know what to do. My instinct was to stay really positive and to assume that he was still alive until, someone could prove otherwise. So we started going into New York every day. We would take the ferry across into Manhattan, and we were trying to figure out what we could do. So we'd go to the piers. They told us to bring pictures of our loved ones, to bring photographs of any scars that they might have, anything that would identify them. They asked us to bring in any personal items, which would help with DNA matches. So I brought in his toothbrush, I brought in his hairbrush, I brought in his mouth guard that he'd played hockey. It was in his hockey bag from 2, 3 nights before. So just brought in everything that I could. And there were some days where we would just go stand outside the hospitals in lower Manhattan, hoping that anyone would be, discovered and brought to the hospital. But it was kind of eerie. We all stood around and we waited, and there's nurses and a few doctors outside, and no ambulances came. There were no sirens. It was like this horrible smell of burning buildings, and basically, no life was coming into these hospitals. So it was the first couple of days were really, really tough.
At what point did you get the confirmation that, in fact, he was gone?
I took the children up to Canada on the 10th of October. We had a celebration of life at our home in New Jersey on the 6th of October, and our house was filled. We had over 200 friends. Their children were swimming in the pool. We were having Frank's favorite beer, listening to his music, eating his favorite food on the barbecue. And I kept thinking, I want to plan a celebration of life. And in my heart, I was hoping that he would just walk down the road, and arrive at this party and be so thrilled, to be here. Um, so we had the celebration on the 6th. And then on Sunday, the 7th, the United States declared war on Afghanistan. And literally, our house emptied out within 3 hours. Everybody packed up, drove back to Canada. And there was just my brother who was with us with his girlfriend, with Zoe, Garrett, and I. And we ended up staying until Wednesday morning when I called the Canadian consulate in New York. And I had always asked them, like, should I stay here? Should I go to Canada? And on that Wednesday morning, they said, if you can, just pack up the kids and go to Canada, and we'll keep in touch with you from there. So we moved up to Canada on the 10th of October. And then I'll remember it forever. We were on our way trick or treating, and it was on Halloween, and it was just after 4:30 in the afternoon, and it was snowing in Saint Sever, and the kids were dressed up in their costumes and trying to make life as good and as positive and as fun. For them, it wasn't like they really knew the magnitude of what had happened. So I just had to make sure that we had fun every day. We'd wake up and do something fun. So the phone rang, and it was the chief medical examiner who was calling from New York, from the medical examiner's office, and said that we have your husband, Frank Doyle. And as crazy as it sounds, when they called and they said that, I thought he was alive. And I was like, now when I look back, I realized that they must have thought that I acted kind of crazy on the call. And they gave me a file number, and they explained that he was identified through dental records. And they said, if you have any other questions, you can call us back. And I ended up calling them back several times that day, just because now that I knew that they had him, I wanted to know how he died. I was very preoccupied. I needed to know that he didn't suffer, and if he did suffer, that it wasn't for long.
You sound like you were so strong in these moments, in these days that passed, and even learning of, the death being confirmed on Halloween. What would you say um, was the way that you healed and went forward from that time? You said you moved to Canada on the 10th. I guess you never left from then.
Uh,
And
we went back to New Jersey because I had to pick up his remains that had been cremated. That was probably the worst day, was being back in the house and the doorbell rang. There was this young woman who just said, "I'm so sorry for your loss." And she stretched out her arms and she handed me this little pine box with his name on it. And that's when it really, hit home of what had happened. So I just remember kind of collapsing in the house and holding on to this little box, and it just became so real. Yeah.
for Zoe and Garrett, you both as kids, obviously you were there, but you don't have a true recollection of what actually happened in that moment. I'm sure you've heard this story being recounted a number of times. How do you feel when you hear this, both of you, your mom describing the events of that day?
I mean, it's always really emotional. And now, because our whole lives we've been hearing these stories, not only from her, but from everyone who was around during that time. And I'm not sure if it's because of these stories that I feel like I have some memories, or if I actually do. But I still feel like I remember some of the aftermath, like the months afterwards.
What about you, Garrett?
Um, Sorry, dog. I mean, I don't know. Some of my first memories probably are seeing the TV and seeing that, not fully understanding it, but knowing that it should be something significant. And obviously, it was so commonly circulated in the media and stuff. It's not something you can be sheltered from for your entire childhood. So I grew up with it, but I don't know. I think because we were in Canada, I grew up under the assumption that it was like something specific to us, and I didn't realize like the gravity of all of that at the time.
What about, I
Yeah.
guess, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say on the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, there was a crew from CBC who came to interview us. We had just done a triathlon to honor Frank. And I remember specifically they were interviewing Zoe and Garrett and, trying to ask them how they felt. And they were so puzzled that why would this team travel from Toronto to video us? And why are they sharing our story? And why is everybody going to watch this, on the news? And I think for them, that was kind of, the Garrett would have been 11 and Zoe was 12. And I remember there was a lot of questions after, the 10th anniversary. And I felt like that's when things really started to get processed for them in terms of the magnitude of 9/11. And it wasn't just our family, who was affected by this tragic day, but we were part of like a big part of history, especially in the United States.
What about for you both, now 10 years beyond that anniversary, now marking the 20-year? Um, how does your perspective change, especially learning about this in some fashion in school, that your family was directly impacted? How do you feel, I guess, marking 20 years beyond that? I'll start with Garrett and Zoe, and then Kimmy, if you want to chime in as well for your feelings.
Um, well, like I was saying before, what really changed for me in at least the past 10, 11 years is knowing that it was a huge event that like rocked the world, not even just the United States, but geopolitical events went into motion all over the place. That, I mean, everybody was impacted by 9/11 in some way or another. So it's not something I can avoid. And I don't know. It's something that I've learned to, it's part of history. It's part of who I am.
And we both study international relations, and like geopolitics. So we've learned so much more about 9/11 and its effects, So not just our little bubble and our family, but the greater world impacts. And it's kind of surreal that it's been 20 years.